Okay, this is lesson 4 on criticism on trial. And I guess maybe I should clarify that title. I chose that title many, many moons ago because we need to examine criticism from a biblical perspective. We want to put the concept of criticism today on trial to make sure that we are acting and responding in a biblical fashion. So let's get into our session here. Remember the definition that I'm operating by. It's a deliberate verbal act that is designed to mock and belittle another while trying to show one's superiority. And we continue in the Old Testament. I don't know whether you are surprised, but when I did this study years ago, I was surprised about how much is in the Old Testament in particular. And as we go through the next couple of sessions, I hope you begin to see a lot of it is in the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible. And the main figure in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy is Moses. And he seems to be the prime focus of Israel's criticism. So Exodus chapter 15, verse 24, and then chapter 16, verse 2 and following. Let me read you the summary that I have. Israel passes through the Red Sea. They've gathered on the opposite shoreline, and they watch the waters cascading down, drowning the pursuing Egyptians. Israel has a spontaneous praise service. Miriam leads them in worship. Afterwards, they resume their journeys. They've crossed this insurmountable body of water. Now they're safely crossed, heading to the promised land. But almost immediately, they encounter another trial. They're running out of water. They locate water, but it is bitter to drink. They criticize Moses as if it was his fault. Couldn't Moses have plotted a travel course that would pass along quiet, fresh, cool streams of water? So what's the put off here? A critical person is quite gifted at pointing out problems, but rarely offers any biblical solutions and personal involvement. Now, what are the put-ons? And I've underlined the ones that I want to make reference to. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 1 and 2, let me turn there. It says this: Brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so you too will not be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and therefore fulfill the law of Christ. This is what a critical person needs to do. Instead of initially criticizing, back off and take a look at where you are at, first of all, and then bear one another's burdens. Help shoulder this for Moses. Don't put it all on him. Second observation here: a critical person is impatient. The encouragement of God's previous miracles do not dismiss their demand that their perceived immediate needs be alleviated. Now, let me read that to you again. The encouragement of God's previous miracles. If you just pause for a moment and think of all the miracles that God did in Egypt, bringing them out of Egypt, crossing the Red Sea, all of those 12, 13, 14 miracles. What happens is they do not dismiss their demand. In other words, the miracles should have caused them to be more patient, but instead, their demands rose to the surface that their perceived immediate needs are not being met. We need water. Well, let's see. Stop and think about the 10 plagues in Egypt. Now, if God is able to do that and bring you out and cross you without a drop of water splashing on you from the Red Sea, what's your problem? He will provide, but they are impatient. Has to have it now. Well, there are two Psalms that you might want to consider. Psalm 5:3 tells us to wait eagerly. Wait eagerly. That means look for the biblical answer. And then wait patiently. Wait patiently. Accept God's timing. Impatient people do not wait eagerly. They want it now, and they are not patient. Then another observation is a critical person expresses gratitude for another meeting their needs. Sorry, I didn't read that right. A critical person seldom expresses gratitude for another meeting their needs. Their mindset of having their needs met seems to be an entitlement or a rights issue. And even when the need is met, they will be critical at the person or the organization on how the need was met. Was it enough? Did it arrive in time? Should it have been more? Should they have done it differently? A critical person seldom expresses gratitude. Now, some of you are old enough, most all of you are old enough to maybe remember that when you were younger, 10, 15 years ago, you yourself, or maybe you saw your parents do this, when something was given to them, when something was done, they wrote a note of appreciation. Maybe they didn't pick up the phone. Back then, they probably didn't have texting and internet stuff type situation. They would write a note, put it in the mail, or hand it to the person. That is a rare commodity today, beloved. In fact, sometimes I'm shocked at the ingratitude or the lack of understanding that appreciation should be expressed when something is done. Does the person want it? That's not the issue. Expressing gratitude is a position of the heart, and it is an act of worship and praise to God who motivated that person to do something. What are the put-ons here? There are several. I will read one from 1 Corinthians, and it seems kind of odd, but let's look at it together. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 17. I rejoice over the coming of Stephanas and Fortunatus and Arcesius, because they have supplied what was lacking on your part. Where's Paul? Where's Paul when he writes this? He is incarcerated for preaching the gospel. And yet, these three men come and minister to him on behalf of the Corinthian church, and he writes a letter back to the church telling them how grateful he was that they arrived and that they came and with their gift. Exodus chapter 16, verse 3, let me summarize that for us. After being satisfied by another miracle, they resume their travels. Once again, they criticize Moses because of uncertain and perceived harsh circumstances. Notice the two words, uncertain and perceived. They were running low on food, and there was no grocery store on the maps. Again, they thought they had it better in Egypt. That is a resounding complaint that the Israelites have when they think that they are going to have some difficult times. In fact, they introduced the flesh pots and bread that were ample, according to them. They became so accustomed to the beatings and cruel treatment, they did not mention loved ones, neighbors, sisters, brothers dying from exhaustion, heat stroke, hunger, thirst, and fatigue. After all these miracles, one would think they would view the next challenge from a different point of view. A critical person fails to understand how present circumstances are part of God's plan, guiding them to a deeper understanding of God and themselves. Critical person fails to understand how present circumstances are part of God's plan, overall plan, guiding them into a deeper understanding of God and themselves. Excuse me, each miracle that Israel experienced after the crossing of the Red Sea was God communicating an aspect of his character to them. But all they could see is their temporary needs that they felt were more important. Now, is eating important? Yeah. Is water important? Yes. But not at the expense of criticizing the servant of God who has been used by God for the complete supply that they would need up to this point. Well, we know these verses, James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, talk about trials. And Romans chapter 5, verses 3 through 5, talk about the purpose of trials, the development of trials in a person's life and what it does. Romans chapter 5, verses 3 through 5 says this, and not only this, but we also exalt in our tribulations. Notice it doesn't say criticize. Knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance, and perseverance, proven character, and proven character, hope. And hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out within our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Exodus chapter 16, 7 through 8 summary. After criticizing Moses for plotting a travel course without access to food, God promises to provide. He also gives specific instructions on how to enjoy his bounty and provisions each day. Moses reminds the Hebrews that their criticizing is ultimately against the Lord. He asks, what are we that we should criticize or grumble before the Lord? Had they forgotten again so quickly the 10 plagues, the Egyptian drowning, the provision of water? And that's a rhetorical answer where the answer is yes, they had forgotten that. But the thing I want you to see here is that criticism is directed toward God's person. When you criticize, you're criticizing God. Well, Rick, I'm just upset with my neighbor, my husband, my kids, or whatever. You're criticizing God. Well, how is that? Because James tells us that when we criticize one of God's creatures, we are criticizing God. And when we criticize about our circumstances that are unpleasant, we are criticizing the sovereignty of God, who is arranging all things for our good and for his glory. I think we fail to understand that our criticism is directed toward God's person. A put off would be Job 13:15, or do a concordance search on giving thanks. But let me take you to Job chapter 13, verse 15. And it says this, Job 13:15. Job's talking now. Though he slay me, referring to God and the difficulties that Job is going through. He's covered in boils from head to toe. I will hope in him. Nevertheless, he says, I will argue my ways before him. Well, Job, you're criticizing. I don't think so. What Job means here is that he wants to present his questions to God. He wants to present his perspective on things before God. Because if he was criticizing, he would not say, I will hope in him, would he? He wouldn't say that. And the Spirit of God is penning his words. And Job is willing to accept death at the hand of God. He's not criticizing God. He wants to present his case. He's looking for answers. He hopes to have his questions answered. And later on, we will realize that God is not obligated to answer our questions. In grace, he will, but oftentimes he just says, hey, trust me. Exodus 17, verse 3, there should be a colon there. Hey, it's deja vu all over again. Here we go. I thought I had just read this account earlier, Exodus 15:22. You know what I did? What is going on? Moses was God's representative. Please note how they speak to Moses. Give us water to drink. They are demanding. They are taxing. They're dissatisfied. They're discontent. They're insistent. They are self-centered. Kind of like the prodigal son, give me my portion of the inheritance. In reality, this is how they are speaking to God. Even Moses is frustrated because when he replies, he says, why do you quarrel with me? Moses understands that their complaint is against God, and he's even more concerned that they are complaining against the God who has delivered them and has provided for them. Again, Moses attempts to draw their attention to what they are really doing. Notice he says, why do you test God? Totally ignoring Moses, they return to their standard line of irrational thinking. When faced with a difficult situation, one, I might add, they saw God working powerfully on their behalf before. They compare their lives to Egypt again with their present situation. They view their present situation more difficult than their miserable existence in Egypt. Well, what are some put-offs here? A critical person often returns to the same topic of criticism. The same topic of criticism. With tongue in cheek, but sometimes it is too real. In some churches, where there is a desire to change something, some of the older members who have been pillars of the church, they will utter, we have never done it that way before. You're rocking the boat. Leave things the way they are. We are content. Critical people return to the same topic of criticism. Colossians 3:2. is one of the verses that I've highlighted here. Let me open it up in my Bible here and read that to you. Colossians chapter 3, verse 2 says this. As soon as I get my fingers working, here we go. Set your minds on things above, not on the things that are on earth. Israel did not have a heavenly perspective. All they had was an earthly perspective driven by their wants. And then another critical person seems to think that somehow returning to the good old days will resolve today's problems. Today's problems. I remember when 20 years ago this, 40 years ago this. Let's return. Things will be better. Well, I call that avoidance. They are blinded to their past, which hinders them from living in the present with very little hope of a future. They are blinded to their past because they think the past was so wonderful compared to today, which hinders them. It's like blinders on a horse. They can't see anything but what is dead in front of them. It hinders them from living in the present because they're always wanting to go back and live in the past, and it robs them of any hope of the future. Isaiah 43 is a powerful passage that I've often used in counseling with people who have gotten hung up on their past. But also, you can read the story of Lot and his wife and her turning back and how that worked out for her. Isaiah 43, verse 18 and 19 says this: Do not call to mind the former things or ponder things of the past. Behold, now this is God talking, I will do something new. Now it will spring forth. Will you not be aware of it? I will even make a roadway in the wilderness, rivers in the desert. The impossibility of a roadway in the wilderness and a river in the desert only magnifies the power of God for us to live in the present with an eye on the future. Another put off is this: a critical person rarely thinks their destructive speech ends at the foot of God's throne. They think they're just spouting off. They're letting off steam. They're getting it off their chest. They think it doesn't go any further than the living room walls, the church conference room, the employer's office, whatever it might be. That's where it goes. It's not going any further. And yet, Matthew 16, one verse, reminds us of these actions and what happens here. Matthew 16, 27 tells us this: For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then repay every man according to his deeds. Beloved, destructive speech passes through the walls of a home and an employer's office and the church building, the neighborhood, whatever, and it winds up at the throne room of God. It winds up at the foot of God's throne, which means that God is going to judge that. God's going to judge that. In Matthew, it talks about our lives being manifested and shown, and every word spoken will be heard and evaluated. Some preachers like to say that our lives are going to be put on the big screen for everybody to see. I don't see that in Scripture. I see that our behavior and our conduct and our attitudes certainly are going to be judged and evaluated according to 1 Corinthians 3 and 2 Corinthians 5. So next time we get together, we'll continue in the Old Testament. We'll continue in the book of Exodus and see what else the Lord has for us. All right, any thoughts that anybody has? Jody, I assume that's you online.
Yes, it is. Sorry I was late.
No, that's fine. Nobody's got any pictures up except Jeanette. The other people are choosing not to turn their cameras on. I had to go get the other computer down at church that we recently purchased, and I had to switch things over from my other one because it kept on freezing up. Long story short, I can't get the camera to work on this computer. So if you have any brainy ideas that you can share